Blue Protocol Star Resonance is set to launch here in just under 2 weeks. And whether you did or didn't get to play the closed beta, or you're just prepping for launch, you might be asking, what class should I play? Why should I pick it? Is there other various reasons to do so? I'm going to do an entire overview for all 8 classes, which do include 2 specs each, so 16 specs in total. We'll go over their playstyles, top DPS picks, top AoE, best healer, even delve a little bit into their lore, as well as recent patches and buffs, and to top it all off, cover my experience from the closed beta, as well as a whole bunch more. What's up, World Utopia here, back in with another video. Today we're checking out all things Blue Protocol. Okay, so firstly, you might be wondering, what classes are there? For a quick showcase here, we have the Verdant Oracle, the Marksman, as well as Frost Mage, Stormblade, Wind Knight, Shield Knight, Heavy Guardian, and Soul Musician. Now this one is named a bit different on the website. Currently it's actually called Beat Performer, probably due to translation issues there though. Let's go over, I'm going to break down each and every single class here and my personal experience that I had with them. So first up here we have the Soul Musician. As I mentioned, it might have another name here, Beat Performer, of course depending on the translation, although in-game it was called Soul Musician. Now this is a Bard style buffer with support hybrid into healing. Actually a very, very cool class. Now for a tiny bit of their lore here, we don't have a crazy ton for each class, but they are the Bard Arcanists. They have melodies that will weave heals, buffs, and even sonic ruptures. Now for their playstyle, as I mentioned, it is a Bard style buffer, but the actual playstyle is damaging into heals, which you'll do via the peaceful tunes. You can rotate out songs, which will buff for team spikes, so kind of a little bit of akin to a Disc Priest in World of Warcraft. And this class has some really cool effects, some crazy cool AoE buffing. Now they do have 2 specs though. So the first one is Dissonance. Now this one is an offensive support that is damage driven heals and procs. So this is the spec that more plays like a Disc Priest, where you are weaving in both damage and healing buffing abilities there and trying to get your proc rate up. The other spec is called Concerto. Now this one does play a bit different. This is the one that has the insane buff, so we'll have a lot heavier team buffing. It does have some occasional healing cadence and procs. Now from some of the Discord comments going over those, they have slightly increased the healing cadence there for Concerto. However, the other healers are going to out-heal this one, especially the Dissonance spec. More than likely this is someone that you bring along to a guild raid to at least buff your team, but it doesn't have the highest healing like Dissonance spec. Although it still can also do a fair bit of damage. It does seem like Dissonance can out-damage it sometimes, since you technically are proccing heals with damage. However, there has been some reports of people out-damaging Dissonance, but the buffs from Concerto are pretty insane. From what I've seen, they can even potentially 2x some of your stats. Now, the core mechanic of Soul Musician is to manage your performance, energy, and passion, while aligning buff songs with the party bursts. So regardless, this is a great teammate to have, especially for buffing damage and just overall buffing teammates. Which do lead me onto the pros here. You can heal while you're DPSing, so it does allow for some hybrid ability there, especially when you do spec into Dissonance. There's pretty insane strong team-wide buffs, damage, crit, etc. And as I mentioned, they have some really cool AoE effects with some nice AoE sustain over time. Although, of course, this class, it does have a bit of cons there. Since it's kind of the jack of all trades, it is a master of none, with technically needing the other healer class, which is Verdant, essentially kind of still needed for the hardest content. I'll go over that class a little bit later and you'll see kind of why. It also does have some resource and uptime management complexities. Since you're essentially weaving in abilities there, it can take a bit of practice. However, I will say the reception from beta is people loved this class, and it definitely seemed like a fan favorite. So if you do decide to play it, your stat priorities will go as follows. Dissonance wants int first, then haste into luck, while Concerto again into int, but then it's going to focus crit and then into haste. Now this is just going off a bit of what I've been reading and some other player accounts, but the skill rating or the hardness level is about a 5 out of 10, 10 being the hardest, with the PvE power and its PvE scalability being an 8 out of 10. Again, if you love support that adds damage and enables big party spikes, then Soul Musician is the class for you. Next up here is a class I saw taken by a lot of people, and that is Marksman, which of course is a DPS class / utility. For their lore, they are the Wardens of the Frontier. They are a pact bound to falcons and wolves to hunt from afar. Now, Marksmans have a ton of different playstyles across different games, but for this one specifically, they are a ranged DPS with Wolf Falcon assists, which give them a strong single target focus. but they do have an AoE spec. The first one though is called Beastmaster. For obvious reasons, they do control beasts, and they have the Storm Arrow spam that allows for some insane single target burst. They do have an AoE spec here though called Falconry, and that's a crit-driven AoE and battlefield control. For those two specs there, it does seem like Beastmaster is the better one. In fact, some people are calling it the best spec in the entire game. Of course, that could vary come launch, but I will say from my experience, what I saw, Marksman did insane damage, and they definitely were always one of the top ones, especially in my guild raids, etc. Now, their core mechanics actually do play into crits, which will then trigger pet synergy, where they can then align their ult for grouping and finishing windows. Now, for their pros, they are a reliable boss single target. This is also according to some CN logs. They do very, very well. They also do have some good team utility here with brief and vulnerability windows and even grouping ults together. Of course, their pet synergy and versatility allows for some additions there. Now, a class doesn't come without their cons though, because Beastmaster is just kind of renowned as the much better spec. They are limited on their AoE outside of ults or even taking Falconry, but that spec does have its downsides. And you also do have to deal with the pet AI quirks. And in literally every single game, the pet AI quirks do play a part. Now, for your stat priorities, Beastmaster will go Agility, Haste, Mastery. The cool thing about this is Falconry will focus on the same two starters, Agility, Haste, and then Crit though for its third. So it won't feel as bad if you do end up swapping specs with the same gear. Now, for its overall skill, I've heard this is actually a really easy class to play. So it is currently 3 out of 10, but the PvE power is 9 out of 10. So if you want a class that's easy to play with really high PvE power, some even saying it's the best in the game, being comfy with consistent range DPS and useful team tools, then this is the DPS class for you. Next up here we have the Shield Knight, which is a Paladin type tank. Of course, usually Paladin tanks have off heals, and this one does as well. Now, for the small amount of lore, of course they are Oath-Sworn Paladin, and they are in the Light Forged Mail. Their playstyle, of course, is frontline aggro, blocking, and with clutch heals. Now, it does, of course, have two specs like all classes. The first one is called Recovery, which has max mitigation and heals. This one is considered the classic tank, which does even give you skills to prevent fatal attacks on yourself. The second spec is just called Shield. This one does have more HP and damage overall, but is still sturdy. Now, from what I gather from comments as well as just playing overall, people actually do prefer the Shield spec, as it is a more heavy hitter class that's really good at keeping up your Radiant Shield. Especially when you do get to end game, you'll have near 100% uptime of your Holy Circle. So essentially the Shield spec has healing, shields, and even damage reduction. So it is considered the more of the fan favorite. Now, of course, its core mechanics are mostly tanking, but it's to maintain your Light Forged body, where you are weaving in Judgment and healing rings for sustain. As I did mention, your healing circle / ring is going to be near 100% uptime with the shield spec near the end game, or depending on how you actually build it. For the pros of this class, it's extremely durable with off healing, rings, and Judgment. It has some really good flexible builds and even raid stability. However, it does have some cons though. Overall, it's of course lower in damage, obviously compared to DPS classes, and it is much slower and methodical mobility wise. Paladins usually do not have the best mobility, so that's kind of renowned for them. Especially if you played games like World of Warcraft, your mobility is quite terrible. Now, for their stat priority, again, this is going to vary per spec. Recovery will be Strength, Mastery, and then into Crit. Now, the Shield spec has somewhat similar here for the stats, but it's obviously going to be Strength for your first prio, then Haste, and then into Mastery. So you're going to skip Crit altogether. Both of these will use Mastery. So if you are one to swap between these specs, you probably should focus on getting Mastery first. But Haste is the main priority for Shield spec. For some smaller tips here that people have mentioned is to rotate your damage reduction, heal rings, and then into Taunt. And of course, pre-plan your boss tank busters. This class actually does require a decently higher skill rating, or at least the difficulty rating is around a 6 out of 10, but its PvE power amongst a lot of people is a 9 out of 10. People really do like the Paladin tank. Again, because of how much versatility it has with off healing and just tanking in general, damage reduction, etc. People really do like this class overall. So if you want a more universally valued tank with clutch sustain, this is the one for you. Next up here we have Wind Knight, which is an aerial mobility lancer. Now, for their little bit of lore here, it is a Sky Lancer blessed by tailwinds. who fight between leaps and dives. Their playstyle here is ground to air loops with dive strikes and even constant motion and even buff stacking. So pretty cool there. They do have some versatility and great mobility, obviously. For the 2 specs here, first up is Vanguard, which consists of Gale Thrust focus with high executions, which that spec will mostly focus on empowering your auto attack, which then those will empower other attacks a chance of making 2 huge burst skills. You're also wanting to constantly energy regen and repositioning there. However, it does seem like the second spec here is actually more favored, which is called Skyward. This one is more aerial juggling and dive finisher. As I mentioned, it is a fan favorite and is actually considered the more hard-hitting DPS, where a lot of people were able to complete the challenges much faster on Skyward than Vanguard. However, again, if you like chain comboing, Vanguard is actually better or more preferable, but it does seem overall that Skyward will do more damage. You also can stay in the air a lot more, avoiding ground-based patterns and boss attacks. It has great AoE and respectable single target damage. It does seem like the primary focus will be an ability called Instant Edge, which consumes sharp stacks. Then you also have some buffs alongside that, which does go into the core mechanics there. You're maintaining that aerial buff. Then you're also weaving in jump strings into powered dives. Again, being able to avoid a lot of the boss attacks. So the pros are, of course, extreme mobility and uptime. Yeah, this class is very universal when it comes to that. And you have minimal downtime when mastered, meaning you can be in the air a lot of the time for this class. The cons, though, it actually does have a very high skill floor. Not essentially a high skill ceiling here, a high skill floor, meaning even just getting the basic grasp of the class is going to take quite a lot. It also misses versus mobile bosses a lot of times. And unfortunately, from a lot of players and even like China client players, they do mention it can be historically bug sensitive, so it can have a lot of bugs attributed to it. For your stat priority here, per spec, Vanguard is going to focus on strength, then haste into mastery. Skyward is completely different here. Strength, of course, as the main stat, then into crit, and then into luck. So unfortunately here, you're not going to have the universalness with being able to swap between specs. Or at least your stats are going to be all messed up for it. Some micro tips here: practice the air control in an open world. Raise your camera also for better aerial aim. So increasing your FOV overall should help you with the class. As I did mention for the ratings, this skill rating is a 9 out of 10. It is a very, very hard class to master. And it also has a lower PvE power at 7 out of 10. I did see some Discord comments saying that this is the forgotten class. So unfortunately there has a really high skill floor and a high skill rating, making it quite difficult to master, and also a lower PvE power. However, if you want the most kinetic, combo-heavy DPS, where you love mastering movement abilities, giving you some near extreme mobility, then this is the DPS class for you. Next up here we have Stormblade. This is a hyper aggro melee burst DPS, and this class is one of the highest fan favorites. For the lore, it is a duelist who can channel thunder through transforming blades, where they do have discipline and burst in a single flash. For the overall playstyle, they do swap between the sword and scythe. They have fast combos and even iframe slashes around boss windows. Now again, just like all the other classes, they do have 2 specs. The first one here is Iato Slash, where you're building up thunder sigils, then that ties into colossal single hit bursts. And looking at some of the build guides, they are saying to use that thunder sigils mainly with overdrive, keeping your blade intent at 100 for instant Iatos, and to only spend damage skills at max sigils. Then you'll apply it into burst volts. Again, that's kind of how the playstyle is. So far, Iato Slash does seem to be the fan favorite, with noting more higher damage potential. But the second spec here is called Moonstrike, where they have sustained combo change, and they were even recently buffed in the CN client. So this one could have more potential in the future. They did some updates to skill Thundercut and Moonstrike. You also are tying into your basic attack for judgmental cuts, and the scythe window with Stormflash and Overdrive. There's not a ton of build guides for Moonstrike currently, or Moonblade. Again, depending on the translation there, it might be a bit different. So unfortunately, that one's a little bit hard to nail down, but they are buffing it again in that CN client, so it might actually pair better in the future. For the core mechanics, you are stacking sigils, aligning your burst windows with boss breaks, and trying to abuse iframes as much as possible to skip damage. For the pros, it is the top single target damage burst. It will literally top any chart that you've seen, and it by far has the highest top single target I've seen in a lot of the logs. Again, it can also iframe and dodge through danger, which is pretty cool there, so you are avoiding that damage. It does have a decently high ceiling, but it is very rewarding once you do get the rotation down. Now, of course, it still does have some cons though. With precision comboing, timing is required. Again, that's where that very high skill ceiling does tie in, but this is different than a skill floor. Skill ceiling just means to get the full potential of the class, you will have to get that combo timing required. That was a bit different than the Wind Knight, which had a high skill floor, meaning that it was hard just to even get the baseline DPS down. This one also has a weaker sustained AoE versus true AoE casters. That's especially the case compared to Frost Mage, and we'll go over that class in a bit. For stat priority, the Iota Slash, that's going to be agility, crit, and then into mastery. Moonstrike or Moonblade is of course agility, but then into haste and luck. So again, unfortunately there, the gear is not going to be interchangeable there. You're going to have to swap around your stats. For some smaller tips here, you do want to save your burst for these stagger breaks. You'll notice when a boss does get a stagger break, it will have that on their bar and kind of tick down with time. Of course, they also do usually lay down, and you do have to learn the iframe timings on key skills, or you can potentially get hurt. For its skill rating and overall difficulty, that's going to be a 7 out of 10. Not the hardest class to learn, but is definitely up there. For its PvE power though, it is a 9.5 out of 10. Again, this more than likely is the best DPS class in the game, even beating out Marksman, which is very close though. So honestly, if you want to be the best on the logs, and you enjoy a high skill ceiling class that is very rewarding, which has some stylish melee and giant burst and even active dodging, then this is the DPS class for you. Here we have our other tank, Heavy Guardian. This is a judgment controller that also does have CC. Now for the lore, they are the Sand Wardens who do shape stone into bulwarks, and they also drag foes into the grinder. For their overall playstyle, they have a big blade that swings, they have the sand grip for the CC, that enemy suction, and they also do have blocks and counters. So very cool one there. Per usual, they do have 2 specs. The first one here is Earth Fort. It's an easier tank with shield offense and even damage reduction. Now, it was a little bit hard to find build guides for Earth Fort, but you're essentially grouping mobs together with sand grip. You're keeping your stone shield up and then popping your resolute breath to detonate. It can actually hit for 30% of max HP right before you re-shield on bosses, and you're also maintaining your rage burst windows. It does seem like people actually prefer the second spec here, which is block. That has steady damage reduction, classic walls as well, and you can even summon giant falling boulders. People also do mention that this one is a higher damage spec. You're essentially feeding into extra crystals that will help your threat. That's going to smoothen your counters as well. It was actually kind of hard to find Heavy Guardian builds here. It was actually one of the lower classes chosen during the closed beta. I will go over those stats at the end. It does seem like Shield Knight was just a bit better, but they still do have really fun playstyles here. People really like block with the boulders. Again, that leads into their group mechanics here. They are grouping enemies with sand grip and stabilizing that blockchain. For the pros, they are the best mob grouping for dungeons, so they really do help out, especially if you don't have a Frost Mage. And they are super tanking. They are forgiving for newer tanks. However, for the cons, it is slower and has more clunky animations. Again, as I did mention, it is a lower demand versus the Shield Knight, as it has modest damage, and it's really only good for dungeons. You primarily obviously want tanks for the harder boss encounters, like the raid bosses. Dungeons really aren't that hard in general, unless you're doing trials, etc. For the stat prioritization, block does go strength, mastery into luck, and then Earth Fort goes strength, versatility into mastery. So again, unfortunately here, you're going to have to swap out your gear, or at least adjust your stats if you want to play either spec. For some micro tips here, we do have grip on the spawn waves, and then announcing pulls for coordinated nukes, especially for those that can AoE damage. The overall skill rating here, it actually is one of the easier classes to play with a 3 out of 10. That's just because it is kind of baby mode tank. Although I would argue that tanking actually does take skill in itself, but overall between the two tanks, this one is much easier to play. For its PvE power, it is actually on the low end here for 6 out of 10, but that also does coincide with it only being a 5% pick rate across the entire closed beta, which is less than half of any class in the closed beta, so there's a reason why it is rated this low. Although if you want an easier, effective CC tank for ad heavy content, and you're just wanting to dungeon farm, or you're even an off tank, this is the class and tank for you. Next up here, we do have our last healer, which is a Verdant Oracle. This is a dedicated support heal class. For their lore, they are groove seers who plant life sigils, where their wounds do bud and bloom back to life. For its overall playstyle, they are a nature blooms with hots or heal over time. They can also shield and of course heal while DPSing, which is their smite spec. And again, that does lead us onto the specs. First up is Smite, which is a combat healer that has buds burst on heal hits. They are essentially tagging enemies to plant their buds and mark them, dealing damage to trigger their heals, and even cycle Nature Ward in there. That's to smooth the spikes overall. Again, this one does have a bit of Disc Priest elements to it as well, so kind of cool there. I like how they're tying those in there for both the heal classes. However, they do have another spec here called Lifebind, which this one in general is of course a max throughput healer. Again, not focusing on damage at all. This one is just pure healing, and they will even have better trimmed down cooldowns. That one essentially, you're just keeping your uptime with Nourish 5 times usually, rolling on the party to precast your Nature Ward before big mechanics, and then dropping your regen, pulse, life bloom as needed. If it's even more safe during the downtime, you can weave in infusions for tiny DPS break bumps. However, this one is more primarily based on just healing, so you really shouldn't focus on DPSing only in those break times. For its overall core mechanics, you are placing hot fields or healed over time, so essentially you're pre-healing before raid damage, and then swapping to burst heals as needed. Of course, for the pros, it is the best raw healing and mitigation. It's always in demand for tougher content. This was of course the more favored healer for pure healing, but it did seem like people preferred how Soul Musician played. It seemed a little bit more fun. It also is flexible. It does have DPS while healing, or you can even full heal, of course. But for both specs there, the Smite kind of like a Disc Priest a little bit, or just playing the regular Lifebind, you could still get some DPS out. However, for the cons, it is the lowest DPS in the game by far. Of course, it's a healer. It's not really meant to do damage like that, and it can feel passive or spammy in calm phases, where, as I did mention earlier, people really did prefer Soul Musician because it's more fun to play. This is just a basic healer, so it can be a bit boring at times. Now, for stat priority wise, Smite is going to focus on int, then luck and mastery. Lifebind is int as well, then into haste, and then mastery. So this class actually does have some parity with the gear, although you will need to swap around the luck and haste stat. For some smaller tips here, you plant your heals where melee is stacked. You're pre-hotting or pre-healing the raid. Hot is heal over time. And then you do, although, have to watch your aggro spikes, as healers are renowned for taking aggro, especially in a lot of other MMOs. That can happen in this one as well. Now, this one isn't actually that hard to play. Its skill rating is a 4 out of 10, because you do have so many heal over time mechanics. It's kind of doing a lot of the passive work for you. Although its PvE power is a 10 out of 10, as this is essentially the backbone of your raid, and it will guarantee a party's success if they can out-heal those damage mechanics, especially if you have DPS that are just standing in fire. So I would definitely pick this class if you wanted one that gets you a guaranteed raid spot and helps your team and guild succeed. So if you want the best healer in the game, this is the class for you. Last up here, but certainly not least, is the Frost Mage class. This is a range burst and crowd control DPS with actually some fairly decent single target damage. For their lore, they are scholars who bind Astral Chill into crystalline sigils. They are the master of blizzards and even battlefield control. Their playstyle overall is long-range nukes. They can freeze, even do slows, and switch between mobile casting and turret beam. You'll see with the two specs here. The first one is Icicle. That one does allow you to be mobile with instant casting and even safe kiting. Now for Icicle, you're essentially building your Mystic Ice with Crystal Veil and Meteor Storm, popping into your Glacial Hymn and then into Permafrost, and spamming your Ice Spear while it's enhanced. You'll eventually get Enhanced Blizzard, so you'll weave that in as well. But this one is super mobile. This is actually the class and spec that I played. I do have a full build breakdown on my channel, so if you want to check that one out, you can do so. They do, however, have one other spec here that is also renowned for being fairly decent. It's called Frost Beam, where you're channeling your beams for huge DPS if your stationary uptime is high. You're essentially dumping your energy into Ice Raid to stack Mystic Ice and Ice Arrows. You could still cast Maelstrom into Freezing Gale, that's to help refill while also using Glacial Hymn and Permafrost. So these do have some similar abilities between the two. Frostbeam is really good early on, but once you get to endgame and the harder raid challenges, you're not going to be able to tank through raid mechanics unless you can push your gear score very high. That is where Icicle actually does win on pure DPS, because if you miss your burst window on Frostbeam, you're going to really struggle on maintaining high DPS. That is actually why I would recommend Icicle spec. If you wanted to though, you could start with Frostbeam and then go into Icicle. That'll help you with your trials a bit earlier on, as that's going to output higher damage, especially because you can be stationary in those trials. However, Icicle is just the better all-around spec in my opinion. For core mechanics, you are building and spending ice procs with pre-positioning to avoid beam drops, again dependent on what spec you take there, and then you are weaving in CC for ad control. For the pros, it is an S tier AoE damage and control. It has safe range positioning, although if you take Frostbeam, that is less so the case. For the cons though, it is not constantly top single target damage in the CM logs. I will say though, if you do build your Icicle spec correct, and you can maintain your Mystic charges for your instant casts, you're gonna do very well. Again, the Beam spec does root you though, so movement interrupts will nuke your DPS in half, but that's why I'd also recommend taking Icicle. And you are really squishy, but that's always how mages are. For the stat prioritization here, it is int then to luck into crit. For Frostbeam, it is int mastery into haste. So the gear is not very universal there. Unfortunately, we'll need to swap it around. For some smaller tips here, you want to pre-position yourself before the boss moves and cancel early if mechanics force movement. Again, that applies to Frostbeam. If you're playing Icicle, just learning your rotation and Mystic stacks, even if it's on a target dummy, will really help you. A ton of practice on Icicle and you will get that one down. For its skill rating, it is around a 5 out of 10 between the two. I would say that Frostbeam is more like a 4 out of 10, where Icicle is more like a 6 or 7 out of 10 for its hardness scale. It can take a bit of time to get the Icicle rotation down. Again, I do have that build guide on my channel for Frost Mage Icicle spec, so if you needed help there, it is an entire breakdown on how to play that class. Definitely worth the check out. For the PvE power though, it is an 8 out of 10. That is because its single target damage is lower than Marksman or Stormblade. I've noticed that even with lower gear score, much lower gear score, Stormblade does really well. And same for Marksman. It's very hard to be competitive as a Frost Mage when it comes to single target damage against those two. But if you want an elite at AoE and CC control, as well as having some nice safe range play, and people loving you in both dungeons and raids, then this is the DPS class for you. Now that does cover it for all 8 classes and all 16 specs. For a quick overview and kind of choice pick here depending on what you want, just to break it down as simple as possible for those that want it. For the best single target damage DPS, you either want Stormblade or Marksman. For the best AoE damage and crowd control, you're going to want to go with Frost Mage. The most wanted tank across the board is usually Shield Knight. However, for easy pack control in dungeons, Heavy Guardian is the choice there. The primary healer and essentially mandatory in hard content is Verdant Oracle. So if you do want a guaranteed raid spot, that is more than likely what your choice is going to be. If you want a more fun buff healer hybrid, Soul Musician is the pick. Everyone I've talked to that played Soul Musician really loved that class and spec. So even though it does get out healed by Verdant Oracle, it's still a fun class nonetheless, and it has some great buffs. You'll still be taken to the raid. For a high skill expression class, you'll go with Wind Knight for that mobility and just having a bit of fun with that and the animations. And if you're looking for a class that might be getting buffed, or at least having some recent CN buffs, Stormblade Moonstrike could be the pick for you. That is specific to that spec there. Overall though, it should cover it for everything. If you enjoyed today's video, like, subscribe, and until the next one, deuces.